Good morning. Looking at all the reactions I've been receiving lately, everything that's going on in the internet, well, not in the internet, in the real world, the world seems to be getting crazier and crazier. I'm beginning to get a little bit worried that the anarchy, that's what they call it, could get more out of control as the days and weeks and months go by. From the reactions I've been getting lately, I'm not the only one. Take a look at the following video and see what you think.
First up, the truth about Black Lives Matter. I'm going to try and tell you about Black Lives Matter in a nutshell, and it's a slightly bigger nutshell than usual, but I make no apology because this is very, very important. And I want to kick off with a call to discernment. It's a biblical virtue. It's mentioned and emphasized dozens of times, and it is essential to living a life of wisdom. Why discernment? Well, because it's needed. There's a lot of labels that are going around at the moment: safe schools, Extinction Rebellion, Black Lives Matter, sometimes even climate justice, liberation theology. I could mention a whole bunch. Each of these labels tends to have a surface appeal, but it is ultimately deceptive because it obscures what those movements are really all about. And these are each, in some way, the suit of clothes that is being worn by cultural Marxism in different contexts, or whatever you prefer to call it. Some people say identity politics, some people say leftism. I'm going to say cultural Marxism because I think that does in fact describe the set of ideas that ties these movements together at their roots. And each of these claims claims to stand for a good cause. Indeed, a cause so good that nobody can deny it. So if you oppose Black Lives Matter, then you're immediately charged with racism. If you're opposed to safe schools, you're immediately charged with harming vulnerable children. If you're against the various climate change movements, you're accused of not caring about the environment. But see, that ain't what these things are necessarily about. You dig below those attractive labels just for a second. You start to discern what's within these labels, what's in these tins that have the attractive labels on them. Let's start at the very beginning. Let's start at the basis for these movements. Let's start at the so-called facts. And you find out straight away that each of these is based on so-called facts that are actually popular deceptions. For example, the supposed underclass of children oppressed by heteronormativity. The fact that mummy and daddy love each other and they think that that's normal. Secondly, the horrifying systemic racism of police officers in America. Or an imminent end is nigh style climate catastrophe. Just a few years before the world will end, we've been hearing in recent times. Or, sometimes Jesus is a figure concerned mostly with the oppressed on earth to empower them in earthly systems. That's liberation theology. Each of these deceptions, especially the first ones I mentioned, they alarm people. These deceptions create the moral high ground for people to get on board, and for all those who are not on board to be ashamed of themselves. This is why when people share this content, they're always falling over themselves to qualify that of course they're against racism. Look, everyone's against racism, bar a couple of really bad people. You don't need to prove that about yourself. But of course these movements force you to, because the implication is if you're not with us, then you're a despicable human being. And these deceptions, through alarming people and making that moral high ground, they gain widespread emotional, now not thoughtful. And you can go out there and you can look at the YouTubers that make videos of interviewing people at these protests and so on, and you find out quickly that on the whole, this is emotional support. It is not thoughtful support, but it is emotional support whipped up behind deceptions. Take, for example, the issue at hand, Black Lives Matter. The catalyst for this was the tragic, and of course it's tragic, and see, I have to sit here and say this as if I don't think it's tragic. Of course I do. Of course I do. The tragic death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. That was a grave wrongdoing, and the police officer should be punished. It's the only appropriate thing to happen because he did wrong. And that is exactly what is happening in relation to that police officer. That's appropriate. But there's an assumption that has been just brought out of that, and similar incidents that the media have really highlighted and paraded from the rooftops in recent years, instead of and as a priority over instances where the racial breakdown was different, and there's been plenty of them, as we shall see. But the assumption that there is alarming, systemic, horrifying violence against black people at the hands of police officers. And the only way we can know whether or not that is true is not by looking at the way the media decide to focus in on particular stories and blow things up and all the rest of it, and the way they choose to portray the narrative. The only way is to look at the data. And I hate doing this. I get it, because these are people, these are lives, and we're going to now start talking about numbers. And also, I hate dividing people into tribes and saying blacks and whites and all the rest of it. I just want people to be people. But I have to do it in order to make this point. And we have to do it because there's no other way we can know whether that deception is true, is a deception, or whether it's actually true. Well, here's the facts. Each year in the United States of America, there are 50 million interactions between the police and members of the public. 50 million. Last year, of those, 1,098 of the people who interacted with police died as a result. 1,004 of that 1,098, so the vast majority of them, were shot. 114 of the 1,098 were unarmed. So in America, gun culture, etc., there's prevalence of firearms in a way that people in other countries often don't realise. That's why there's a large number of people who do get shot, because they have guns or they have other weapons. So 114 were unarmed. So we're getting the numbers down now. 48 of those unarmed ones who died, people who died, were white, and 28 of those people who died unarmed were black. Now, who were the 48 white people? Did we hear of them? There's a certain crafting of this and a choosing of focus here, which creates the narrative. We have no clue about the circumstances actually of each of those individual cases, except the few that we might be able to name from media reports. We don't know if violence was involved. Undoubtedly, in quite a number, it was. We don't know if they happened to be, if they appeared to be armed. No doubt in some cases they did. We don't know if they were affected by drugs. So there's all sorts of things we don't know. We just have those numbers. Also, we don't know what race the police officer involved was. So yes, 28 unarmed black people were shot and did die at the hands of police last year. Was it a white police officer who resulted in that death? We don't know. We do know that statistically it's much more likely that black members of the public will interact with black police officers, Hispanic members of the public will interact with Hispanic police officers, and so forth, because of the racial demographics of different areas. It tends to be reflected in the police forces and the public at large. Now, we do know this. The number of unjustified killings of black American police officers basically is a number significantly less than 28, okay? And we compare it with all those other numbers as well for context. But of course the reply is this: black people only make up 13% of the population. But these figures indicate more than 13% of police interactions, more than 13% of police killings, more than 13% of police shootings. But see, that is true, but it is not the relevant statistic. The relevant statistic here is share of violent crime, not share of the population. Share of violent crime, and therefore level of interaction with the police. That's the relevant statistic. And here are the facts. 40% of homicide offenders are black, 30% are white. 13% of the population is black, 70% of the population is white. So you see the cause of this disparity. Black Americans commit about a quarter of all violent crimes, and white Americans commit 44%. Now, there's a lot of rhetoric that's been doing the rounds concerning the fear that black Americans should have in their hearts when they leave the house. The fear of being killed, of being shot, of being victimized by police or by whites. These statistics do not bear out the need for that abject fear. They just don't. And these are absolutely reliable stats from the relevant bodies, including the FBI. Now, not only that, but in terms of the general public, we know, for example, in 2016, and these numbers tend to be within range for each year, 533 white people were killed by black people, and 243 black people were killed by white people. Now, given the population disparities, that's a big difference in numbers. And again, it doesn't bear out the narrative that black people leaving their homes and going around in the streets and interacting with police and others should fear. And we'll see how that this is brought out in just a minute. let me quote two studies before I move on in this subject. Firstly, Roland Fryer, an African-American economist, professor at Harvard, the youngest African-American to receive tenure at the university. He responded to media reports of police shooting black Americans by authoring a study in the last couple of years. And he said that the results were, quote, the most surprising results of my career. He studied over 1,000 police shootings in 10 major police departments, and he found, 1, officers were more likely to fire their weapons without having first been attacked when suspects were white. He found, secondly, black and white civilians involved in police shootings were equally likely to have been carrying a weapon. So there wasn't a disparity with, say, unarmed black people getting shot more. Officers are about 20% in the police department he focused in on for this particular study because it required so much detail in Houston. He found out that officers were 20% less likely to fire their weapon in circumstances where they might be expected to do so when the suspect was black. And he said no matter how he mixed the variables, no matter how he altered his approach within reasonable parameters, he found continually that blacks were less likely to be shot or that there was no difference between blacks and whites. Another 2019 study found that black police are more likely to shoot black civilians, white police are more likely to shoot white civilians, and Hispanic police are more likely to shoot Hispanic civilians. It also found that the factor which determined racial representation in police shooting figures was not race, but how represented that race was in the proportion of violent crime in a given area. Well, of course, that's no surprise. All that tells us is that on the whole, generally speaking, police are doing their jobs. Because if there is a high proportion of a certain kind of person in violent crime and they have a high proportion involved in this kind of thing, the police are there. The police are putting their lives in harm's way to protect the public, to do their job. You know, the deception that... Look, I got to say again, I hate doing this. I hate reducing this to stats. These are lives. This is serious. But it's got to be done for this reason. It has to be shown that the movement is based on basically deceptions. Now, I'm not saying that there's not, when you drill into the real details of some studies, you do find issues here and there. But the deception here is that black people are being systematically murdered, systematically abused, systematically victimized. The deception that they should be afraid, they should be terrified of being gunned down, that there's systemic and violent and abject racism all over the place. There is no way to support that from these statistics. I know there were slaves. I know that there's been a civil rights movement. I know that there's deep scars and there's grave evil that's been done. But it's important to note that this is modern day. This is now. It's 2020, and my goodness, progress has been made. This is America who voted for a black president. Not once, but twice, as many times as they could for his tenure. There wasn't a black candidate the next time around. Black Lives Matter and the media alarm people with deception, just as those other movements do, whether it be Safe Schools, whether it be Extinction Rebellion, etc. They all have the same DNA. And they recruit emotional support for a political cause which is in its DNA, and I say this advisedly, anti-Christ. You say, well, what cause would that be? Well, they're not exactly hiding it. I mean, their statement of belief and other commentary is on their website. Very, very clear, remarkably clear, actually. And it's a purely Marxist creed of queer affirmation, abortion, destruction of the nuclear family, transliberation, abolition of police, unforgiveness, retribution, resentment, violence, and anarchy. Just for starters, they even call each other comrades. They say, let me quote you some stuff. They say, black lives are systematically, this goes to what I was saying before, systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. They say Black Lives Matter is an affirmation of black folks' humanity, our contributions to this society, that's all good, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. They say that there is a, quote, war on black life. They affirm the gender spectrum. They say that they wish to, quote, dismantle cisgender privilege. They say that they want to, quote, disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. They say that they aim to, quote, foster a queer affirming network. They say that they intend to, quote, free ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking. They say they wish to, quote, dismantle the patriarchy, quote, dismantle capitalist values and imperialism. They claim that they are, quote, witnessing a rise of conservatism that has resulted in a fascist president. They call on the USA to, quote, the American imperialist empire. They demand, quote, reparations for black people. Their Facebook page notes that posts which, quote, preach the gospel will be deleted. They say, quote, we deserve and we demand reproductive justice that gives us autonomy over our bodies and our identities. They call for the national defunding of police and their ultimate abolition. And that's just Black Lives Matter. That's not the umbrella group to which they belong, which is the movement for Black Lives, which is could it be possible, even more radical and even more avowedly Marxist in their approach, which is astonishing. Let me just show you a few examples before I move on. They say they advocate for this: defunding the police, a moratorium on rent, mortgages and utilities for blacks. A moratorium on rent, mortgages and utilities for blacks, the abolition of prisons and detention centres, ending the criminalisation of youths, the end of zero-tolerance school policies, banning the arrest of students, that's handy, end bail, end fines, end court fees, free access for all black people to lifetime education, including university fees, school, etc., a government-funded income for all black people, the embedding of Marxism into public school curriculums, the radical redistribution of wealth under tax codes, and I could go on, but I won't, you get the picture. Basically, this is a thing of no responsibility, only victimhood. Remove everything that is making you a victim, even if you're responsible for it, like crime, for example. Handy. Viola! Freedom! But you know, far too many are busy blacking out their Instagrams to bother reading the publicly available material, or indeed to observe the rotten fruits of this movement: the burning churches, the vandalised cities, the looted businesses, the riots, the people being forced to kneel and repent for their race, for heaven's sake. I could go on. And the reality is this: nearly everyone in America and in Australia, especially the Christian, hates racism, right? They love the environment. They want to help the poor. They hate seeing kids suffer. So don't be pressured into virtue signalling these obvious facts about yourself by giving power to a movement that hates the gospel at its core, because that's what's going on here.
That was a good explanation of things that are going on at the moment, if you take time to read between the lines. Unfortunately, after that he got very religious, and as religion goes, that's one of the roots of all evil, so to coin a religious phrase. So we'll leave him there, but as you can see, he's spoken a lot of truth. Only what do we do? The problems in the world are going to get worse because of the politics, the Western politics anywhere. Democracy isn't real democracy, as Socrates laid out back then. If it's not done properly, obviously you get a lot of people who try to win over with propaganda. Popularism it's called, and this is what makes and breaks a country.
There once was a couple who owned a ship. They loved their ship, but they knew nothing of sailing. They needed a crew and a captain. On this ship, there were sailors and one stargazing navigator. The sailors would laugh at the wise navigator dreamily observing the sky, while they ran across the deck sweating as they hoisted sails and kept the ship moving. Crossing the oceans was great fun, but the ship owners knew they still needed a captain. Each day, the sailors would flatter the owners and themselves, boasting of their sailing skills despite having no knowledge of navigation, quarrelling over who was the best. Competing for their affection and approval, each sailor hoped that the owners might make them captain. One night, the impatient sailors tricked the owners into drinking so much wine that they couldn't see straight, and then they demanded, "Now, make your decision. Who is your captain?" Socrates drew this analogy comparing the ship to the democratic state, the ship owner to its voting population, the sailors to politicians, and the navigator to a philosopher. His warning was that voting is a skill and requires specific education for people to make informed and rational decisions on behalf of the state. He understood the threat and allure of demagogues who seek support by appealing to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people rather than by using rational argument. Voters are fed enticing ideas by politicians who either tell us what we want to hear or validate our worst fears in order to secure our votes. This is their wine. Socrates said the only capable ruler is the philosopher, with their grasp of the big picture, a sense of the overall good, and a willingness to examine ideas and beliefs to find truth. His point was democracy can only work when all voters are equipped with an extensive education, because without the capacity to make informed decisions, demagogues will persuade us and our democratic choices will never really be our own.
And here's some more on democracy.
Used to thinking very highly of democracy, and by extension of ancient Athens, the civilization that gave rise to it. The Parthenon has become almost a byword for democratic values, which is why so many leaders of democracies like to be photographed there. It's therefore very striking to discover that one of ancient Greece's greatest achievements, philosophy, was highly suspicious of its other achievement, democracy. The founding father of Greek philosophy, Socrates, is portrayed in the dialogues of Plato as hugely pessimistic about the whole business of democracy. In Book 6 of the Republic, Plato describes Socrates falling into conversation with a character called Adimantus and trying to get him to see the flaws of democracy by comparing a society to a ship. If you were heading out on a journey by sea, asks Socrates, who would you ideally want deciding who was in charge of the vessel? Just anyone, or people educated in the rules and demands of seafaring? The latter, of course, says Adimantus. So why then, responds Socrates, do we keep thinking that any old person should be fit to judge who should be the ruler of a country? Socrates' point is that voting in an election is a skill, not a random intuition. And like any skill, it needs to be taught systematically to people. Letting the citizenry vote without an education is as irresponsible as putting them in charge of a trireme sailing to Samos in a storm. Socrates was to have first-hand catastrophic experience of the foolishness of voters. In 399 BC, the philosopher was put on trial on trumped-up charges of corrupting the youth of Athens. A jury of 500 Athenians was invited to weigh up the case and decided by a narrow margin that the philosopher was guilty. He was put to death by hemlock in a process which is, for thinking people, every bit as tragic as Jesus' condemnation has been for Christians. Crucially, Socrates was not elitist in the normal sense. He didn't believe that a narrow few should only ever vote. He did, however, insist that only those who had thought about issues rationally and deeply should be let near a vote. We have forgotten this distinction between an intellectual democracy and a democracy by birthright. We have given the vote to all without connecting it to wisdom. And Socrates knew exactly where that would lead, to a system the Greeks feared above all, demagoguery. Ancient Athens had painful experience of demagogues. For example, the louche figure of Alcibiades, a rich, charismatic, smooth-talking, wealthy man who eroded basic freedoms and helped to push Athens to its disastrous military adventures in Sicily. Socrates knew how easily people seeking election could exploit our desire for easy answers. He asked us to imagine an election debate between two candidates, one who was like a doctor and the other who was like a sweet shop owner. The sweet shop owner would say of his rival, "Look, this person here has worked many evils on you. He hurts you, gives you bitter potions, and tells you not to eat and drink whatever you like. He'll never serve you feasts of many and varied pleasant things like I will." Socrates asks us to consider the audience's response. Do you think the doctor would be able to reply effectively? The true answer, "I cause you trouble and go against your desires in order to help you," would cause an uproar among the voters, don't you think? We have forgotten all about Socrates' salient warnings against democracy. We have preferred to think of democracy as an unambiguous good rather than as something that is only ever as effective as the education system that surrounds it. As a result, we have elected many sweet shop owners and very few doctors.
With this in mind, with the problems that might not really be problems, just being made into problems, for people to follow their own agenda, looking at that, let's start discussing things. That's why I've set up this group. Let's get as many people as possible into this group so we can discuss things with as many people from different walks of life, from different ranks, different professions, from everywhere, and let's start talking about things how they really are, with real democracy in the backs of our heads, Let's change things if possible. Let's look at education, because obviously education, we've seen it lacking in the world, lacking in England. Finland, it seems to be working there. But there's a lot of things we need to look at, but without getting aggro with each other, without putting each other into different categories, political categories, because we're not. We're all human beings. We're all human beings. So let's look at it that way. Let's see how it goes. Get back to the real democracy. It seems to be something that could work if we don't let the sweet shop owners in. I shall be looking at different issues, political issues, and we shall be discussing them as full as possible. And let's see how it goes.